Hey everybody, it's Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier here for a long overdue next episode of East 17th Street, joined by Seth Tao, coming off a 94-69 Indiana home loss to Illinois on Tuesday night. And it seemed like a good moment to jump back into the fray here and give you our thoughts in person on what is going on with the state of IU basketball right now, and specifically the Mike Woodson era of IU basketball. Seth, last night, as I said, Indiana lost by 25. It was the second worst loss by Indiana on their home court at Simon Scott Assembly Hall. And it was impossible to not notice the mood of the crowd. And I think, as you posted on social media last night, it wasn't even just as a result of the product on the floor. This was before the game. Boos of Mike Woodson before the game. And, I compare it to something that really stood out to me last season. It was the Michigan State game, the final home game, senior night or senior day, I guess it was. And I remember thinking that day, it was a full house. I went into it thinking, man, this is going to be a pretty hostile game. The crowd's going to get ugly. There were almost no audible boos that entire day. They won, so that mattered, but there was no boos before the game. That was, an ugly situation going in. They were clearly out of the NCAA tournament, barring something miraculous at the Big Ten tournament. So I remember thinking, well, maybe the kind of the online world of IU basketball that we live in isn't the same as like the fans in general, the general population of the fan base. So to hear what I heard last night, and I know you were there, I wasn't, so you saw it in much greater detail. It tells me we've progressed to another level here. So why don't you just kind of recount, your experience last night, sitting, specifically amongst the student section, which I think is even a more interesting way to experience what happened last night.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to be fair, on your point about the Michigan State game last year, wasn't that one part of the mini plan? Like, was that during spring break, so students wouldn't have been there?
That might be a good point. I know it's always right around there, so that is entirely possible. And that the students in positive or negative ways change how you experience an IU basketball game. There's no doubt about that. But nevertheless, I do specifically remember going into that day expecting negativity and never really even experiencing it all the way through to Mike Woodson's true fans comment and Anthony Leal telling the crowd to chill. Like, it was all positive, all, I think everybody, at least optically and from my perception, was kind of still on board, at least to some extent, even though the online crowd certainly wasn't.
Yeah, well, I guess so. Last night, I didn't really know what to expect from the crowd, I guess, going into last night. I mean, I did not think that game was going to go particularly well for Indiana personally. I mean, if I was surprised that the line was the spread on that game was only 5.5 points for Illinois. I know the home court advantage and everything, but just with the way Indiana had played against Iowa, and this being the best team that Indiana will have played since the Bahamas, like I did not think that game was going to go well, particularly on the court. I didn't really know what to expect from the crowd, though. It's not like, like you said, you went in expecting like a hostile environment. I didn't really know what to expect. And it's not like that was plainly clear, like from the second I stepped into the building.
Right.
It wasn't just, it didn't really start to become evident until, they're introducing the lineups before the game. And there were, Mike Woodson has gotten, kind of mixed reactions in the past, some boos, some cheers. Obviously depends on the game, the crowd, the time, everything like that. But I don't think I had ever heard him be this loudly booed during pregame intro. I mean, it was more boos than cheers, I think, and it was mostly from the student section. The boos were raining down, and I mean that really just set the tone for what was to follow. I mean, it was I've been in plenty of games the last several years, and even before that, you think back to like the Archie Miller era, where I've been there for plenty of games where Indiana struggles and the fan base gets restless and they start booing the team. I've been there for plenty of games like that. I don't think I've ever seen Assembly Hall have the sort of energy that they had last night. The crowd there, I mean, they were booing within the first few minutes of the game. And look, it was justified with the way Indiana was playing.
Right.
I'm not here to sit on a high horse and tell people, whether it's right or wrong to boo your favorite team at home. That's not what I'm just recounting what I saw. And based on the product on the court, I mean, booing is, if you feel like that's a valid reaction to your team struggling on the court, then it was totally justified with the way they were playing last night, because I mean, it was just an absolute train wreck of a basketball game. And we'll get into more of that later in the show, I think. But I mean, the boos just, picked up more and more. I mean, Illinois pulled away very quickly. I mean, they led by 15 points, I think, by the under 12. And then they were up by 23 at the under 8. And I mean, it was, at that point, the under 8 in the first half. It was the under 8 in the first half that the, student section started to chant "Fire Woodson."
Right.
And to be fair, I don't think it's the first time that we had ever heard "Fire Woodson" chants in the bill. There were some games where I think we heard small pockets of fans doing it even last season. And you're not going to rehash what the decision that was made to bring him back necessarily last year, but I'd never. It was louder and clearer than ever, the "Fire Woodson" chants last night, and it was 12 minutes into the game that those chants started, because Indiana was playing really, really, really poorly. And I mean, to a certain extent, there is only so much Woodson can do. Like it wouldn't have gotten any better if he had put all the walk-ons in. It might have sent a message, but the game wasn't going to get any better. Woodson himself isn't out there leaving guys open and taking bad shots, but obviously it all trickles back to Woodson. I mean, and really, on top of that, I don't think I'd ever seen this fan base hold the type of grudge and the sustained amount of ire towards an individual IU player as they did towards Trey Galloway last night.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd ever seen that before, to where, IU players have gotten booed before. IU players have made fans angry before, but man, like Galloway, it almost felt like every time he touched the ball, he was getting booed. The fans cheered when he checked out of the game, and then were booing when he checked back in the game. I mean, they, during a timeout, they did like they do this almost every game, like a pre-recorded video segment where they put 3 songs on the board and ask all the players on the team, which song they would play, which song they would skip, and which song they repeat. And when they put Galloway up there, the fans booed.
Right.
And
Yeah, and I know you said you don't want to like pass judgment on fans. I'll do it in this case. I think that's ridiculous. Um, you know, I know based on things I'm hearing and seeing that people feel more empowered to make it personal towards college players because they're making money now. I'm sorry. That's still a guy that's 22-ish, 23. I'm not sure how old Trey Galloway is. He's still a really young guy. He's given everything he has to the program. He plays as hard as he can. Does he have flaws as a basketball player? Yes, he absolutely does. But to make it personal on that level, I have no problem at all like booing the product on the floor as it happens, like including all obviously that's directed at the players, but to make it personal, like you're saying, to when a guy's at the free throw line missing free throws, or when they show him on the video board, that's so counterproductive to anything you might want to think you're doing as a fan, that I think again, everybody's got to process it in the way that they feel like is appropriate, but I don't know what anybody thinks they're accomplishing doing that.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not saying that the fans are right by
No, I
doing
know
that.
you're not. I know you're not.
I'm just trying to. I'll let people root for their team the way they want to root for their team. That's kind of how I take this. But anyway, yeah, like I'd never seen the IU fan base at home like have that directive and sustained ire towards any individual player on IU. And I mean, look, I will say Galloway was struggling for sure last night,
For
but
sure.
it is not like he was the only one. That's what I think surprised me a little bit, was like just the fact that they seemed to pick out Galloway out of the bunch, and whether that's just because he's the leader of the team or whatever it is, like I'm not sure that you could say. And obviously Umar Ballo finished with the box score numbers that he did, but
Right.
I don't know that you could say like Galloway's effort was any worse than what Umar Ballo was putting out there last night in the
No,
first half.
no, not at all. That's exactly what I wrote last night. Like, I think Ballo ended up with 16 points, 15 rebounds. But if you just watched him play defense the whole game, it was pretty pathetic. And he got kicked out. So,
And and the rebounding effort the last several games, and again we're going to get more into the on court stuff later, but the rebounding effort the last few games I think has been atrocious from this team. Like just I mean, even games when they've racked up offensive rebounds, and I feel like it happens. They get 3 or 4 on one possession, and then there are too many other possessions where guys are just standing around and not even making an attempt to crash the boards, and just watching the play happen. And Illinois had 10 offensive rebounds in the first half, I think, and I mean they were just running circles around these guys. But anyway, back to
yeah.
the atmosphere.
Sometimes I think there's no better measure of where a program stands in rebounding, and I'll probably come back to this a few times because I recommend everybody go watch Brad Underwood's press conference last night, because he was not only giving some clues as to how he thought about playing Indiana, but his own team was coming into this game off a really crappy game against USC, and he had to figure out a way to get his team motivated. And he talked a lot about rebounding and how much he emphasizes it every day. They do rebounding drills, and it's really just part of the culture of the program. I don't get the sense that that's the case with Indiana, even though they had showed some level of progress from a rebounding standpoint. As with a lot of things that we'll get to, doesn't seem to be sustainable right now.
I did have a little more to touch on with the atmosphere, because I didn't get to what I think spoke even louder than all the boos was, because like we said, we've seen plenty of, even if it was louder than normal and more aggressive than normal. I mean, we've seen plenty of games where they get booed. I don't think I'd ever seen a game until last night where half the student section left before halftime. I mean, I'm sitting in this, the media row that we have, we're sitting basically in the student section,
Right.
and, like kind of in the middle of the students. So, I mean, we could hear students behind us every time they put up a bad shot and it clanked off the rim, saying, God, we suck, or what the heck? Like, and I mean, just students, as it was getting closer to halftime and the game was getting worse and worse, I mean, there were students just getting their coats and leaving. And I don't think I'd ever seen that before. And actually, I got to credit my girlfriend with this line, because I didn't even think about it until she mentioned it. But man, what a role reversal to have, IU football now has the fans staying the whole game, and IU basketball has the fans leaving at halftime.
That is a great comment that I didn't think about either. I mean, some of it was the margin. Like, you've never seen them leave like that in the first half, but they've never been down 30 in the first half at home either. So, I mean, there's a certain sense of reality that this thing isn't happening, and there's no point in staying.
And I think it spoke volumes. Like, when they came back out and are playing in front of a half empty stands, that are significantly more empty than they were when they left. I think that speaks a lot of volumes. And obviously the second half on the court was not as ugly as the first half. They rallied a little bit and, played at least a little bit more respectable basketball until the fight at the end.
Right.
But it was not as ugly in that sense. But I mean, even when things were going well or going poorly, I mean, just, the crowd had thinned out so much. I mean, the reactions were just muted like the rest of the night, it felt like. I mean, not that fans weren't cheering or booing or whatever it may be, but like it was definitely quieter, in the second half. And like you say, there was a finality to it at that point. They just dug themselves so deep a hole. They went on a little run and were still down by like 20 points. And, there's only so much you can do to get the fans excited on a night like that. But I think that spoke even louder than the boos. It's almost like a protest. Like the fans basically left in protest.
Yeah, I mean, and some of that you mentioned, the second half wasn't as bad, but that's kind of like the oldest story in sports, right? Like, when it's that bad in the first half, guess who else notices that? Illinois noticed that, and they kind of let off the gas a little bit, even if they didn't intend to. Mentally, that's like an almost impossible scenario for Illinois to keep up the level of effort they had when
Yeah.
everybody leaves. And um, but you did mention the fight, and I did want to get to that. Not to rehash it. I don't think ultimately don't think it was that big a deal. No punches were thrown or anything like that. But I just I'm just trying to process in my mind whether or not that says anything about kind of where this program's at. The fact that it got to that point, as I saw it, and I think you might disagree with me here. So curious as to your take, but I think what Luke Goody did was being a competitor, um, but it was obviously a very physical play. It was kind of on the margin, I would say, in terms of him kind of cracking down and making a very physical block out with 2 minutes to go in a game that's over like that. I have no problem with it though. I think compete all the way to the end. I think that's what he was doing. I think the initiator in the whole situation was Visic, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name. Getting into somebody's face. I don't have any problem at all with what Miles Rice did. He deserved to, get a technical for what he did, but as a teammate and as a guy just trying to step in and kind of break things up, I've got no problem. Ballo, I think, got what he deserved. He should have been kicked out of the game. I think the thing I think you're going to probably disagree with is I think when you're looking at those situations, you got to stop and think, why did this ever happen to begin with? It happened because of a Visic, and I don't think he should get off any easier than Ballo, unless Ballo like stepped in and threw a punch or something. All he did was push somebody. The guy fell down because the camera people were standing there. It wasn't that big a deal. I do think Ballo got what he deserved, but I think a Visic should have gotten the same outcome. So quick thoughts on that, and then if you think there's any larger meaning to what went down.
Yeah, I think I agree with you actually on that. I mean, I don't really have any issue with what Luke Goody did. I think Visic, or if we're saying his name correctly, I think it was a little more, it was a little prolonged, a little,
Yeah,
he was really getting up in Luke Goody's grill, talking smack. At that point, they're up by like 30 points or whatever it is. The game is over. I mean, by that point in the game, there as many, if not more, Illinois fans left in the building as there were Indiana fans, and I mean, the game was over at that point. There's no reason to be talking that much smack, and I get it. We're not, the heat of the moment. You never, heat of the moment. I get it, but I mean, Ballo escalated the situation for sure,
for
and
sure.
that was completely unnecessary and really embarrassing. Like that, that kind of this game was bad enough without that incident, and Ballo doing that kind of took it to rock bottom. I think last night. As if this wasn't already an ugly enough night, then you have something like that happen. Like Umar Ballo cannot be doing that, especially, like I said, he finished with 16 and 15, but his effort was really poor all night. Rebound, he has a lot of rebounds, but there were too many other possessions where he was just standing back watching defensively or rebounding or whatever it is.
Right.
Like he was not an effective player for Indiana last night, even despite the numbers. And for him to come out and do that, and surely, obviously, the frustration of the whole game is baked into decisions, like that for Ballo. And maybe it was well intentioned, standing up for his teammate, but you cannot do that. Like
Right.
that just took it to a new low. And you know, I don't know that I'm gonna say it's necessarily egregious or a disgrace or anything, significant like that, Avicic was allowed to stay in the game. And like I wrote in my story, like if that incident had happened when Assembly, in the first half when Assembly Hall was still full, they might have booed the refs for not kicking out Avicic. But, especially at that point, like I think they probably kicked out who they felt like they had no choice but to kick out. And at that point, we're
Right.
just, they just want to get everybody out of there as fast as
Right.
possible.
Yeah. I mean, if I think about trying to cast a positive spin on what Ballo did, like if you think about the spectrum of things he could have done in that scenario, like he could have just been like, oh, I don't care. I'm just gonna sit back here and watch it, or he could have gone in there and really tried to throw a punch. He didn't do either of those. And if again, trying to be positive here. Like he sees the 7-footer for Illinois, like, and he's thinking like, man, I'm the only guy that can get in there and really stand up for my teammates. I don't know, that's positive. But the point I'm trying to make, going back to the larger, is there a, a question about what it means that the program is, at least he cared. At least, at least there's some sense within the program of standing up for each other. But sometimes that's a negative too. Like sometimes people are like so stressed out and so like frustrated that it manifests in that way too. So I'm not saying I agree with either one of those points I'm making. I'm just like throwing out like, what it could mean, if anything. And a lot of times these things don't mean anything. It's just heat of the moment type situations.
I circle back to something that I hear more from the women's basketball team, the players and the coaches. They always say Terry Moran tells them to play with emotion, but not play emotional, and
Mhm.
they crossed that line in that moment.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good way to put it. Um, you know, you mentioned, I think you mentioned Archie Miller, uh, end of his kind of tenure. As I was thinking about last night, the only other scenario I can think about where that was that ugly in recent history anyway was 2021 at the Big Ten tournament, as Indiana kind of got ran off the court against Rutgers. And I think that was like the first game that fans got to attend at the end of COVID, and they booed the team off the floor. They booed Archie Miller. I think there were fire Archie Miller chants, and he got fired a couple of days later, as it turned out. I mean, can you think off the top of your head of anything that approximated last night other than that scenario?
No, I really can't. I mean, the end. I Tom Crean's last year was my first year covering the program when I was a sophomore in college. But I mean, that run kind of came crashing to an end in the Big Ten tournament that
Mhm.
year. Like that's when he, his last games were in the Big Ten tournament, and those the Archie Miller game you're talking about, that happened in Indy. The
Right.
Tom Crean Big Ten tournament, that was I think it was in DC that year, and
That sounds
so
right.
and so not that there aren't IU fans in DC, not that there wasn't an IU contingent there, but it's obviously not going to be the same. And that reaction, and they fired Crean and then opted opted out of the NIT to avoid any kind of fan backlash. Like kind of would have been like what we saw last night.
Yeah,
And
that's kind of why I brought it up.
yeah,
Yeah, I think,
yeah,
there's a clear bias within the athletic department. Obviously the Fred Glass isn't there anymore, but there's a lot of the same people. There's a clear bias to avoid scenes like last night, and it just makes you wonder, like, they obviously they all saw what happened last night. They don't want to have this go on for 2 months. So, it makes you wonder, like, if last night was truly an inflection point for them as well. It certainly seems like it would have had to have been noticed, and there's probably a lot of conversations happening this week.
yeah. I would imagine. I mean, especially. I mean, look, they've got. It would be a different sort of conversation about it, I think, if they had another home game coming up next. But they're coming up on 2 back-to-back road games.
Right.
At Ohio State and at Northwestern. And look, let's be honest. Indiana usually draws pretty well when they go up and play at Northwestern. So even if they go stink, if they look like that at Ohio State, I mean, who knows how ugly it could be? The fan reaction they get in Evanston, and it's hard to think like what could happen if what it would be like if there might be a riot in Bloomington if they look like if they keep playing like this at Ohio State and at Northwestern. And I think the next game is home against Maryland, I think.
Sounds
And
right.
if and I mean, there might be a riot if they look like this in these next 2 road games and they don't make a change. If they keep everything, if it's still if it's still Woodson, if it's still the same sort of lineups and the same guys seeing playing time and all of that, there might be a riot in Bloomington. And let's be honest, as we talk about people's jobs and playing time, none of this is personal attacks. We're all just,
Right.
this is, we don't have issues with anybody as people. This is purely basketball and talking about the state of the program and all of that. But yeah, like we are at that point now.
Yeah, and that's kind of what's unfortunate about it. And if something does end up happening with Mike Woodson, that'll be one of the first things I write is, we need to get back to putting Mike Woodson on his pedestal, which I know is going to be hard for people, but he's one of the greatest players in the history of the program, also one of the most beloved, like, one of Bob Knight's favorites, one of, just one of the best like guys around the program.
And if and whenever it ends, like his legacy, as a coach will be what it is as far as the on court play.
Sure.
But for everything that happened on the court, he is probably the best guy who could have been running the program at
Yep.
the time Bob Knight died.
Yeah, that and there was always that conversation about, we need to hire an IU guy. We need to hire an IU guy. And I wrote this in 2021. It's like, I don't think you should hire an IU guy, but if you're going to, he's the only one that makes sense, at least at the time. Maybe Steve Alford was the other one, but I don't think that was really an option at the time. So he I know he frustrates people, but I think a lot of it is just he's the guy in charge. Like, it was nasty towards Archie Miller, it was nasty towards Tom Crean. But now I think with the passage of time, I don't think people have that same animosity towards those guys. And I think, especially in the case of somebody like Woodson, I think you just, if it happens, you just got to let it go and, let the guy still be somebody that's regarded the way he was as a former IU player.
Yep.
So, let's talk. Let's talk a little bit about the product on the court, because Indiana's not just losing games, right? I mean, they are getting embarrassed at least the last couple of games. And you wrote on Saturday after the Iowa game about all the times that things like this have happened. It's kind of almost like the opposite of IU football because where people wanted to take shots at the IU football schedule, you also had to take notice of, hey, they beat Nebraska 56-7, and they beat Michigan State, whatever it was. I can't remember. There were some like, only if you are a really good football team do you do that. And by comparison, only if you've got some real problems do you fall behind by 30 in the first half on your home court or get run off the court game after game after game, year after year after year, when it's the real marquee matchups, when it really comes down to whether or not you've got something there. So I guess your your reaction to that, because I can't get past that. Like if they were losing a lot of close games, and Archie Miller lost a lot of close games. One game from his era that stands out to me was one of the Purdue's better teams. It was Carson Edwards. I think it wasn't Haas. It was the other 7'12" guy.
Matt Harms.
Yeah, that made a tip in at the buzzer to beat IU, but that game was like 48-46. It's like IU was awful, but they competed their ass off, and you're just not seeing that with Woodson in these big time games.
I mean, even in the non-big time games, these guys have played down to their competition so many times this season. It's not like the red flags haven't been present. It's not like we haven't been warning people all along that there's a lot of concerns here and they're getting away with a lot, early season win. I mean, they were losing at halftime to Eastern Illinois. One of the worst teams in the country, Eastern Illinois. And yeah, you can bring it all the way back. And yes, teams are allowed to improve throughout the course of the season.
Right.
But let's also be honest with ourselves in that in college basketball and college football too, but in college basketball, it's not like the NFL where all wins are equal. Not every win is equal. Like the margin of victory and the way you play in each game matters. And these are things that stand out on the resume and impact your team's rankings and analytics and metrics and where you stand as you enter conference play, and which impacts how much margin for error you have in conference play. And again, we warned everybody that there were concerns here and they were going to have a lot of work to do, and here's where we are now. We have a team out there, Indiana out there is playing very much for themselves. They are. They
Yeah.
are. There's a lot of disconnected play out there, both defensively and offensively. A lot of bad shot selection, a lot of hero ball. And look, there's sometimes when hero ball is okay when no one else is hot and one guy is the dude and he has the hot hand and you're riding the hot hand, you'll let that slide. Or if you have somebody of like a Trace Jackson Davis caliber, there's almost no shot he's going to take you're going to be disappointed with.
Right.
But no one on this roster is Trace Jackson Davis, and
Right.
there's just even shots that get made. I mean, yes, you like to see guys like Kane and Carlisle and Bryson Tucker looking confident when they fire off these mid-range shots, but when these guys are taking mid-range jumper, long twos, pull up off the dribble when there's 20 seconds left in the shot clock, it's like, what are we doing here? Like,
Right.
this is not winning basketball in 2025. And there's just a lot of guys who look like they're playing for themselves. And especially when it gets to a point like last night, when Illinois is just running it up, and to a certain extent, you almost understand why. Put yourselves in the player's shoes in a game like that, and it would be a little hard not to check out mentally.
Right.
But these guys look like they kind of checked out. Whether it's quitting on Woodson, whether it's quitting on Indiana, whether it's just quitting on themselves. These guys look like they quit in the first half last night. And that is the biggest sin, the biggest indictment of this program right now is not it. You could dive into the numbers any which way you want. But when you have guys out there wearing Indiana across their chest that look like they would rather be anywhere else, can you really blame the fans for wanting to be anywhere else?
Right. Yeah, and it kind of segues into something I wanted to touch on. One of the narratives about Indiana going into this season was their talent on the roster. I think there's pretty clear national consensus that Indiana was, if not the most talented team in the Big Ten, one of the top 2 or 3 most talented teams. But you didn't necessarily see that reflected in preseason rankings or predictions. There was like, yes, they're talented, but can they get over the hump? Have you ever heard anybody say that before?
A couple times.
So I mean, I guess I just want to revisit that point. Did they have it right? Did we have it right? What was Indiana talented coming into the season?
Yeah, I mean, they have talent. Maybe some of the talent is a little overstated, or in some sense. I mean, certainly Kane and Carlisle has been disappointing this season. I think he's the guy who probably stands out the most. I mean, Umar Ballo has been Umar Ballo. He's put up some really good numbers in some games, and he's been really dominant in some games. But I think his conditioning has been a real concern, and it shows up in his defensive energy quite often. I think, Luke Goody, you can't knock Luke Goody's effort. Luke Goody's effort and his leadership have been among the best on the team. But, streaky shooter for sure, especially early in the season. He, took a while to really get going. And, you could go player by player here. There is talent. It might be flawed talent, but this roster is too good to be getting blown out by 25 points every night. It's really hard to fathom that, like, a team that's this talented, like, how is this team losing by 25 points every night? And there's some pretty clear answers as to why that's happening, but this team is too talented to be playing this poorly.
Yeah, I guess another way to ask it is if, do you think if Brad Underwood or Matt Painter or Tom Izzo was coaching this team, if we'd be having these same conversations right now? I suspect not.
Yeah, I don't know. That's hard to that's hard to say.
Yeah, and speaking of Painter, like, one thing he said in an interview a few years ago that's always stood out to me, and it ties into Indiana because he got approached by Bob Knight at a coaches meeting. I think it was coming right off of his Robbie Hummel teams where he had some real early success with kind of some under-heralded guys, and he tried to capitalize on that success by, recruiting, 5 stars and guys that didn't really fit what he was trying to do. And he said Bob Knight approached him and said, what are you doing? Why are you getting away with, from your culture, from what makes Purdue, and, how you've had early success. And he said, that really resonated with him. And since has got gotten back to that and has been really successful ever since. And it just kind of makes me think, what is the strategy that Mike Woodson is recruiting to? Like, is he just assembling a roster of, you know, good players that don't necessarily fit what he's trying to do on the court? Is it, kind of a little bit of a band of misfits, guys that, freed up in the market late in the spring, and those are just the guys he could get? I don't think there's a clear identity that he's trying to recruit to right now.
I mean, yeah, I can't really disagree with any of that. I mean, that's kind of the pigeonhole you put yourself into when you are building a team that's almost entirely portal based. I mean, and let's be clear here, like this, Mike Woodson and Matt Painter as well, building a roster right now in 2025, 24, that's different than, Matt Painter making adjustments back in 2011 or whatever it is. It's just a different era of college athletics, and the transfer portal and his obvious and NIL obviously have completely changed everything. So it's just a different landscape now as far as roster building for college basketball. But that said, I don't know what to say. Like Woodson, he acquired plenty of talent in the offseason, and it always did feel like a bit of a clunky fit. I mean, because clearly they were and may still be, I guess we'll see, running back playing with two bigs, which IU fans all loved last year. And and the numbers are what they are with the two big lineups with Renew out there. But obviously Malik Renew has been injured for all of this. But yeah, I mean, they've got talent, they've got pieces, and maybe there's another coach who could kind of make them fit together a little bit better. But it's a fair question to ask. What is the strategy as far as roster building, the players you're bringing in? How are you just bringing in just a bunch of dudes and you'll try to figure it out later? There's a real chance that that's what they're doing right now with these guys. And I mean, it is what it is.
I think my sense is you need to have, as a college basketball coach, if you want to be competing at the highest levels, to really be an elite program, you have to have a damn near religious conviction to your culture. And, you're only going to play probably 8-9 guys. You're only going to have 13 scholarship guys on the roster. They better fit what you're trying to do, and they better be bought in on what you're trying to do. Otherwise, I think you end up with things looking like they do now. And you can't miss, like you mentioned, Kanan Carlisle. Maybe he'll figure it out, I don't know. But you think about the guys in the transfer portal that they were rumored to be targeting at that same spot, like a Ryan Conwell, who's killing it at Xavier right now, or Connor Hickman. You can't miss on these guys. I wrote from day one with this season, like Luke Goody and Kanan Carlisle kind of represented in my mind what the ceiling of this program was going to be, because they needed production from those two guys. And I agree with your assessment of Goody, and I think overall he's been a positive, if not inconsistent. But man, it's a very fine line, a very delicate art that you got to get just right. And I don't think, if you know who you are, I think it becomes really difficult to do that. And I think there was an interesting kind of sticking with the recruiting topic for a moment. There was an interesting update on a high school prospect that came out today. Nate Ament, 5-star guy that Indiana offered a couple of years ago, and they've always kind of been involved, but I never got the sense that they were really getting a lot of traction with him. I talked to him over the summer at one of the main Adidas events and didn't get real good vibes at that point, but he named a top 11 today and did not include Indiana in even his top 11. So I don't think we're seeing a lot of traction from a high school recruiting standpoint with much of anyone at this point. There's some larger stories there that when the time's right, I'll share either in written form or on this podcast. But it kind of goes to a lot of the things that we're talking about. right now, and it's just one more aspect of, what seems like a, you know, probably hyperbolic, I don't know, but it seems like a death spiral at this point.
Yeah, I mean, things are quickly tail spinning in the wrong direction.
And it's weird, right? Because going into last night, we're talking about a team that was 13-4, 4-2 in the Big Ten. Like, okay, that sounds pretty good, but it's interesting how, like, even before the game, the fans, like, they understand what's going on. You can't just look at the records. You've seen this product so many times. Fool me once, shame on me, right? Everybody kind of knows that Indiana eased their way into this season with a pretty weak non-conference schedule, and it was a little bit of a smoke and mirrors game. Now, as I wrote last night, I didn't like come out and say Indiana needs to fire Mike Woodson, because there's a path. It's a not seemingly not very attainable path, but the way I described it was, Mike Woodson's era is like having an F very late in the semester, and you basically got to get an A+ on the final exam to avoid failing. That's kind of where he's at right now. There's 13 games left in the Big Ten, a lot of chances for quad one wins, but I don't see how he pulls out of the death spiral based on the way things look right now.
Right. And here's the thing, even if they do put together a run and get to the NCAA tournament, say they, is just getting to the NCAA tournament enough at this
Right.
point?
No.
Like, and that would constitute, by your definition, probably getting an A on the final exam to pull yourself out of this to get into the NCAA tournament from this position.
Right.
And I don't know that, because going into the season, I don't think, before, everything has happened the way it's happened, just going into the season, I'm not sure that, you would have said simply making the tournament would be enough for him to return next year.
Yeah. No, I don't think it ever was the case. I think it was always
And this
kind of
doesn't
a
look like it. This doesn't look like a team that can win multiple tournament games.
no. I mean, they're a team that if they get hot shooting the basketball, they can beat teams like you saw Penn State, Rutgers, but that seems like fool's gold at this point. It's not sustainable. It's not part of who they are. They can have a hot day, but they can't have a 4 hot days in a row and go on a run. They're just not built that way, at least by all indications. And it goes to another thing that Brad Underwood said last night. Again, recommend people go listen to that. Game planning against Indiana. Their clear intention was to take away Luke Goody and Mackenzie Mbako from three. He was pretty proud of the fact that they only got off a couple shots and started the game 0 of 13. I think they started that made them 0 of 22 against Illinois over the last 2 years until they made some garbage time threes. But you know, his point was he said there were people on Indiana that they were letting shoot. I think people can figure out who those people are. It wasn't Mbako and Goody, and Mbako and Goody didn't do much of anything until late in the game. So I think there's some. I think it's hard to imagine that that Rutgers game, that Penn State game was anything more than an aberration, or that they might end up winning a few games over the course of the next month or two because they have days like that, but it's not going to be anything that sustains them.
And look, let's context now that we've seen what's happened the last couple of games. Let's give maybe some updated context to those Rutgers and Penn State games. They played against Rutgers without Dylan Harper,
Right.
and Rutgers on the whole has, even when they've had Harper, has not been as impressive as anticipated. And that's right now. I mean, Rutgers might miss the Big Ten tournament at this point. So
Right.
Ace Bailey was unbelievable in that game for Rutgers, but that is not some puff out your chest type of win to beat this Rutgers team this year. And then I'm not going to shy away from what I wrote after Penn State, that I thought that felt like a game that could be a turning point when you
Yeah.
look back in the season. If that was if they got things turned around, I think I was going to circle that Penn State game and the way they pulled that game out in a really unique, hostile environment. It was hostile, but also, they were loud. It was just a very uniquely loud, I'll say, environment in Philadelphia. Like the way they pulled that game out, I thought that might have been the game to circle back to is the day things really changed. But let's be clear here. They came out and got hot shooting for maybe 10 minutes, the first 10 minutes of the second half, and then proceeded to nearly implode again and almost blew the game. And it's this team is capable of getting hot in spurts like that, but even so, they just the way they play basketball leads to makes them susceptible to those sorts of implosions where they could still blow the game.
Yeah, and not to mention, you never know what the other team's going through. It didn't. Uh, I didn't go without noticing that Penn State turned around their next game and lost by 40 at Illinois, an Illinois team that didn't have Yakachonis for that game. So,
And I
clearly,
remember hearing somebody, I didn't see it myself, but I remember hearing somebody point out that they saw Ace Baldwin like throwing up in a trash can, like back by the locker room at the Palestra that day. So again, maybe there was a bug going around or something, but yeah, you're right.
so I've got notes about talking about Indiana's offense and defense. I don't know how much I want to get into that. I think everybody kind of knows that where that stuff stands. One thing I did notice, kind of going back and looking at Ken Palm numbers, is it reminded me in Mike Woodson's first year, that 21-22 team, they had a top 30 defense according to Ken Palm. And I do remember like thinking, when that team late in games, they'd put in Xavier Johnson, Rob Fennessy, and Trey Galloway as kind of like their closing defensive unit, and they would lock people down more often than not. And somehow they've gotten away from that identity. I mean, the last couple games have been the antithesis of that. I mean, it's just been embarrassing. They can't stay in front of the ball. They can't stop anybody. They can't execute. Like, how many times do we see just wide open shooters, either as a result of a player not executing the game plan, or the game plan just being flawed to begin with? But there's no, from a defensive standpoint, I just think the slippage, for whatever reason, from the early time in Woodson's era to now, is just it's hard to process, unless it's just they don't have the same caliber of defensive players. I mean, we all know Fennessy was a really good defender, and X and Gallo as well, but still, I got to believe a lot of that's cultural. A lot of that's just people figuring out what Mike Woodson's got to do, trying to do from year 1 to year 4.
Yeah, I mean, it ties back to what we talked about before with, is this just a collection of talent, or,
Mhm.
how well do these pieces fit together? Like, that's a part of this too. But I mean, it's not just this year's team. I mean, last year's team did the same thing. I mean, these guys just overhelp on so many on so many shooters, and that's got to be a product of the system where they're just taught to overhelp like this, and then it just leaves wide open 3-point shooters, and it's gonna burn you. And Indiana gets burned by this when you play against teams like Illinois that can shoot the crap out of the basketball.
Yeah, and one more Underwood nugget from last night, like that was something else they locked in on, was taking Umar Ballo out of the paint, making him guard a pick and pop guy like a Visic. I think I don't think he exactly said this, but I think they picked up on film that Ballo is not good in space trying to defend people. He's more of a rim protector, chasing down dribble drives. But if you make him guard somebody, that's taking him out of a strength. So I think that was another thing that Illinois picked
Yeah.
up in game planning.
And it was noticeable. Let's be clear. It
Yeah,
was noticeable. Like when Ballo got dragged out to the perimeter, his defense
yeah,
was atrocious.
right. And not everybody can do that. Like Penn State didn't have a big who was gonna be too concerning out there. But if you've got a 5 who can go out there and shoot the ball, or otherwise cause problems, it's be ready for that theme to continue throughout the rest of the year, because we know everybody copycats, and it was clear watching that Ballo was struggling out on the perimeter last night. I want to just talk a little bit about kind of Scott Dolson. We touched on, just kind of the optics of last night. I've paid a lot of attention to, what he says when he gives his interviews. He's talked about his process that he goes through. He seems like he's very methodical, very process oriented. I think one thing I would be stunned if it's not already happening is just a process of getting internal buy-in for what the next step is here. I think, that's kind of always the first step. And he's talked about that, in other situations. And, my sense with the Tom Allen situation last year was that, that was well underway kind of at the midpoint of the season. I think it was the Rutgers football game last year when Indiana got blown out by Rutgers at home. I think that's kind of when the wheels got rolling to not only start that internal process, but to start the process of mapping out here's what our ideal candidate looks like, and then ultimately um, going down a path of communication. I think most of the communication happens, at the agent level, but I gotta believe we're at least somewhere in that timeline of, it's obviously very private. And, you don't hear about it, but I think if Scott Dolson's doing his due diligence, he's well down the road here.
There's no way to fully know, like you say, but I mean, again, we witnessed the scenes we witnessed last night, and Scott Dolson is sitting courtside, at the scorer's table. He hears this, he sees this, he is watching the same game that we're watching. He's watching the same Mike Woodson we're watching. He's hearing the same, chants that we hear. And look, fan chants should not determine an athletic director's
Right.
actions, but the scene is only going to get uglier if
Right.
things don't turn around, and there's a real possibility things don't turn around.
Right. Yeah, and the only other thing I wrote down here to just kind of wrap up is I just wonder if Mike Woodson's even really enjoying himself at this point. Like, I know he came into this job with like a nostalgic view of what IU basketball is, from his time, from the Bob Knight era. College basketball is a lot different than it was the last time Mike Woodson was in the game. With transfer portal, NIL, just everything involved. I just wonder. I don't ever get the vibe, and of course, when you're losing, who the hell's having fun, right? But I don't get the vibe that he's having a great time, and I I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't make this decision easy on everybody. But that's not sourced or anything. That's just pure opinion from my standpoint, as is this entire conversation. To be honest, this is all just kind of, we've hit an inflection point here clearly, and what does it all mean? But I don't get the sense that Woodson's really experiencing that what he thought he was going to experience when he took the job, from the standpoint of being the IU basketball coach.
Yeah. That's a good point. He's surrounded. Look, he's surrounded by his buddies, all the time. Like, Randy Whitman showing up at almost every home game. Like, IU, alums from that era are around the program at all times. So, maybe that's given him the vibe that, the little bit of the vibe that he needs. But you're right. It's just, it's hard for me to think that Woodson fully knew that what college basketball coaching was going to be like when he came into it. And here we are 4 years later, and it's not to say that Woodson didn't have success in Indiana, and not that we should be talking the past tense necessarily, because
Right.
He's still a coach. There's been success in his tenure. They hadn't beaten Purdue in a decade, and he, snapped the streak and beat Purdue several times. They especially, they snapped the losing streak up at Mackey Arena against Purdue.
Yeah.
They, broke the drought of going to the tournament, and he's won, he's 2-2 in the tournament. He's won 2 NCAA tournament games. Obviously, he set loftier expectations and goals for himself at the beginning, and really throughout every year of his tenure. He's talked every year that, he expects to be competing for a national championship and winning Big Ten championships and hanging banners and this and that. And clearly that hasn't happened yet. So,
Right.
but to say, there's a difference between that and saying, that it's been an abject failure of 4 years and no good has come from this. But you're right that this is, last night was a watershed moment. I like the phrase you were using last night. The toothpaste is out of the tube now, and it's you can't really what does the path to come back from last night really look like? And, obviously, we talk about the on court, that, as far as coming back on the court, and piecing together the rest of the season, but just for this team and optics wise, and just to kind of get the fans back on board, what does the path look like to come back from a disaster like last night?
I mean, look, fans are finicky as hell. Like they were booing before the game, but if Indiana was up 20 in the first half, they would have been raucous and besides themselves with with joy. I viewed it as kind of like to steal from the movie The Gladiator, like a win the crowd type moment. Like they were very hostile and negative, but Mike Woodson could have won the crowd last night. But so that's the path. It's just as we've covered here for almost an hour now, the path doesn't look very likely. It's becoming a little bit silly to expect something different than what we're seeing. I mean, there might be good moments, but the path seems pretty well laid out at this point. It just seems like more a question of timing, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, I think that seems like a good as place as any to leave it off. Hopefully we'll be doing more of these. I got away from a little bit with everything going on with kids and the CFP and everything, but hopefully with one sport to cover now, we can do a little bit more podcasting here down the road, and kind of seems like we'll have a lot to talk about. So he is Seth Tao. I am Mike Schumann for the Daily Hoosier in East 17th Street. We'll catch you next time.